Welcome to LabMinutes.com. In this video, we will be installing Cisco Nexus 1000V on VMware with Layer 2 mode. We will look at combinations of installing the VSM manually as well as using the OVA, and installing the VEM manually and using the VMware Update Manager. We assume that you have basic understanding of the Nexus 1000V. If not, feel free to watch our video RS0018 Introduction to Nexus 1000V before proceeding with this lab. So here's our lab setup. Now in the physical topology, we have two ESXi servers, ESXi1, ESXi2. Each is equipped with 4 network interface ports, vNIC 0 through 3, and we also have an iSCSI storage device connected to our network. Now in the logical topology, going from left to right, since we are doing layer 2 in this video, we are required to use all 3 interfaces. Then here just as far as control, management, and packets, and we choose to separate them into individual VLANs here. It doesn't really have to. It can be the same VLAN. You can split them in whichever way you like. Now for here with the control VLAN 111, control VLAN is used by the VSM to manage the VEM as well as pushing out configs, so on and so forth. And it's also used the same control VLAN for communication between the active and standby VSM to maintain the synchronization. Now on the management VLAN here with VLAN 112 is used by the VSM to communicate with the vCenter, so it has to be routable, assuming it's not the same VLAN as the vCenter. And that's the same VLAN that we're going to be using to SSH into the VSM to perform our configuration. Here's the packet VLAN. Here we have VLAN 113. It's just a isolated layer 2 only VLAN that's used between the VSM and VEM. For the VEM to forward any kind of packets, it cannot process locally to the VSM for further processing. So just to reiterate, the control VLAN and the packet VLAN doesn't have to be routable. It just needs to be layer 2, provide layer 2 adjacent between the VSM and the VEM in the layer 2 mode. Okay, in addition, we also have a vMotion VLAN 59 that's also isolated, and also iSCSI VLAN 60 is also isolated. Okay, both of our ESXi server has the management IP and the VLAN 32 with the IP of .4 and the .6. So here we're going to keep it consistent. Anything that's on the ESXi1 is going to end with the last octave .4 and ESXi2 last octave .6. And we have a vCenter server at the IP of .5. We have a domain controller, which is also a jump box at .40, and a separate server, which is a test server that we're going to be using in this lab at .42, that we also have an update manager install. Okay, so to start our lab, we're going to have everything connected to the vSwitch 1, which is just a regular traditional VMware vSwitch. And we're going to have uplink using a vNIC 1 to the upstream switch. And once we built our Nexus 1000V switch and assigned 2 available NICs 2 and 3, you can see here we're going to be doing port channel using LACP. We're going to start migrating all of our VMs over and let it connect to the network through the Nexus 1000V instead. So you can see we have a lot going on in this lab as far as the IP address and VLAN, so feel free to visit our websites and download this network diagram, maybe even print it out and have it in front of you as we go through the lab. That might comes into handy. Okay, so now let's go ahead with our lab configuration. So some prerequisites to our installation. First, you need to add all the ESXi servers to the vCenter if not done already. Second, if you plan to use the Update Manager to install the VEM, then you need to have an Update Manager installed on one of your servers. Third, you need to download the Nexus 1000V package from Cisco.com. And last and most importantly, make sure you have all the required information as far as the IP address, username, password, VLAN numbers, and name, and anything, basically information that we will need as part of the installation. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is to install the VSM primary. And before we can do that, we need to create the 3 essential VLANs that we talked about, which is the control, management, and packet, to be mapped to the interfaces on the VSM. So to do that, this is just the regular traditional VLANs on the vSwitch 1 that we mentioned we're going to be dealing with. So here with our first ESXi number 1, go under the configuration, networking, we'll click on property, and we'll just add those VLAN. I'm going to copy and paste the VLAN name just to make sure we didn't have a typo here. And the first VLAN is control, which is VLAN 111. Finish. Then the second VLAN is the management VLAN 112. Okay, finish. And last VLAN is 113. And we need to add both these VLAN to both ESXi, since we're going to put the secondary VSM on the ESXi number 2. So let me hop onto that configuration, get networking on the vSwitch 1. Go ahead and add the same set of VLAN here. 111. And here is 112. And the last one, which is the packet, 113. Okay, now that we have the VLANs ready, we can create a VM for the VSM primary. So here, right click and go to New Virtual Machine. And there's also a minimum hardware requirements that we need to set. So let's click Custom. We'll go next. We'll give it a name of the VM. Here we'll call it N1KV. Give it PRI for the primary. We're going to place it on our iSCSI network storage with the VM version 8. For operating system, it's going to be the other Linux 64-bit. And all it needs is just one core, so we'll leave everything at default. For the memory, minimum required is 2 gig. So set 2 gig. And for the interface, we mentioned the VSM requires 3 interfaces. So set that to 3, and each one will be mapped to the corresponding VLAN we just created. So 111, 112, and 113. Okay, so default, and we are going to create a new virtual disk. And the minimum disk size is 3 gig. And let's make sure we do thick provision as well. We'll go next. We'll leave it at default. And let's edit. Because what we want to do is to remove the floppy, since it's not needed. Also is to map that to the Nexus 1KV ISO, which we have downloaded right here. And this is the version we're running, 421 SV2. Okay. Make sure it's connect that power on. Click finish. Now it's created. We'll start, and let's bring up the console. Okay, so here we want to bring up the new image, so press enter. And now we're just going to have to let it run until we are prompted. So from time to time, I might need to pause or fast forward the video so you guys don't have to sit through and wait for all these to be done. Okay, so we're now prompted for the password. So let's type in the password, though it doesn't really show on the screen. Okay, just make sure it meets the password complexity. So here, confirm the password. It's asking you what kind of role you want this VSM to be in, and we want this one to be our primary. So type primary. And the domain ID, just make sure you pick the domain ID is not existing or creating any kind of conflict if this is not the first VSM that you deploy. But for us, we're just going to give it 1. And now it says saving config. You'll just have to wait. Okay, now it's asking if we want to do or step through the wizard, basically a setup wizard. But actually we're going to cancel on this and do the actual config ourselves. So it's going to be pretty much the same. But we just want to see what's going on underneath, so we say no. Now we prompt to lock in, and we'll type in the password, and now we are at the switch prompt. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is to change the host name to match what we assigned to the VM name, and that is LM-N1KV. Okay, now we have to, by default, let's see, so if we do show run domain, let's do show run SVS. You can see by default here the SVS domain is 1, control VLAN is 1, packet VLAN is 1, is also in a layer 3 mode right now, which we did not want, so we have to change all that. So we go SVS-domain, and we first going to change the SVS mode to layer 2. Okay, then we have to define the control VLAN that we said we're going to use, which is 111, as well as the packet VLAN 112. Okay, so that's all we need. Now we have to configure the management interface IP. So by default, management interface doesn't have an IP. With the interface, management interface 0. We'll assign the IP on the management VLAN 112. So 172.168.1.16/24. Some shorthand that you can do. We don't have to type out the full subnet mask anymore with the Nexus OS, so enter. And by default, the management interface is in the VRF management. So if you do show VRF, let's see. Do show VRF, you can see there's a management VRF. So now we need to configure a default gateway. And for that to work, we need to get under the VRF management to configure the default route. Again, a little bit of a change from the IP route VRF if you're familiar with that. Now instead, we're going to get under the VRF contacts management and define our IP route, which is our default route under there. Okay, so 172.168.112.1. Now we do show IP interface brief. Again, make sure you specify VRF. You can see the protocol uplink up, and if you're trying to ping the gateway 112.1 VRF management, specifying the ping, you can see we can successfully ping our gateway for the management port. Okay, so that should be all we need right now, just to get the primary VSM up. We do show module, you can see it's the only VSM that's being active right now. So let's kind of close this one out. And what we're going to do next is to bring up our secondary or standby VSM. And instead of doing manually this time, we're going to do it through the OVA just to show you the difference. So what we do is to go to File and then deploy OVF. And again, the OVA file can be found as part of the Nexus 1KV package that you download from Cisco.com. So here we have already had it pointed to exact same file that we obtained from that package, .ova. So we click Next, Next again, and then Accept. Click Next. For the name, we'll give it LM N1KV-SEC for secondary. And you can see here there's 3 different options that you can choose. And the first 2 is you're going to be basically going to be asking you for the series of parameters as part of the VM creation, and then you don't really have to do anything else. It would do pretty much the configuration on your behalf with the basic config such as the IPs. As opposed to do it manually configure way, you will be prompted and step through the wizard just like we did with the primary. But just keep in mind all of these are pretty much for the, by default, they are layer 3 mode. So if you choose these first 2 here, you'll basically assume that you want to do layer 3. But for us, we're going to do a layer 2, but for secondary, you'll see in a second here, we're going to do manually configured the Nexus 1000V. We'll click Next. For the secondary, we want to put on the second ESXi server. Again, put that on the iSCSI host with a thick provision. And now you can see how you don't have to specify how many interfaces you want the VM to have anymore, because this is part of the template of the OVA. So now we just need to assign the appropriate VLAN in those interface. It's actually nice enough to tell you what each interface has what functionality. So control maps to control, management maps to 112 management, and packet is mapped to the packet. Okay, so next, since we're going to be doing this manually, actually let me backtrack a little bit so I can show you. Right here, we didn't really read this informational text over here. So you can set if you want, so it says if you use this deployment option, you have to manually configure it without the use of the installer application or OVF. This option is selected, please ignore property section ahead. So what it's trying to tell you is if you're prompted for further parameters input, there's no need for you to do that because you want to do it manually. If you were to deal with the other 2, it's going to ask you to enter all the information when prompted on the property sections ahead. So again, just pay a little attention on this. For us, it's again manually configured. So when we hit that, it looks like it reset the VLAN for us. So let put that back. Management and 113. Next, this is the property sections, which we can totally ignore because we choose to do it manually. So we'll click next. If you review it real quick here, you can see the size, the disk, some of the properties that is part of the OVA already. We actually will once we get out of this, we'll go and take a look and see as far as the hardware specification was used to build the VM. Okay, so we want to power on after deployment, so click Finish. Okay, so while it's creating the VM, let's go ahead and SSH to our VSM. So here, let's bring up PuTTY, and we know we're going to be connecting to 112.16, which is the IP we assigned to the primary VSM. Now we accept the key, and now we are logging in. Okay, so now we are in the primary VSM on the SSH. Looks like our VM has been successfully created, so close, and it should be power up right now. Okay, so we'll open console. Okay, we'll let that run. While that's still coming up, let's take a quick look at some of the hardware settings that it did. So CPU, you can see is 1, memory is 2 gig, just like we did on the manually configured VSM. Okay, then again, 3 network adapter settings or configuration with that maps to each individual VLANs here. Okay, so it looks pretty much just like the one that we manually create with the primary VSM. Okay, so we'll click OK. So you can see here we have the primary on one host, the secondary on different hosts. Obviously on the uplinks that you configure in the vSwitch, you need to make sure the layer 2 are working between the two, otherwise it would not be able to communicate across those control and packet VLANs, and it would not come up or communicate. So let's go back to the primary VSM. All right. So there's a few more things we need to do for the secondary to connect to the primary. First, we need to give it a password, which is the same password that we set for the primary. And now for the role, we will specify as a secondary this time. Okay, so it's going to cost another reboot. You want to do that? Yes. And domain ID has to be identical to one that you set with the primary. So this is going to go ahead and reboot right now. Okay, so we're now back at the login prompt, and if we go and look at the SSH session to the primary, you can see there's a little log message that the module 2 is detected, module 2 being the secondary supervisor. And if we do show module, you can see now we have, before we have 1, now we have the second, which is a standby supervisor that's on a standby state right now. Okay, so if you do show SVS domain just to verify everything looks good, so we have domain ID 1, control VLAN 111, packet VLAN 112. The control mode is layer 2, and right now we have not really connected this VSM to the vCenter yet, so that's why it said the VC is failed. Okay, so what we've accomplished so far is to bring up a HA pair of the VSM. Now what we need to do is to connect VSM to the vCenter. So let me make sure I have that. First, what you need to do is to download an XML file to be installed as a plugin to the vCenter. So essentially, you can see it's a form of authentication to make sure only certain VSM is allowed to connect to the vCenter. So the way to do that is bring up your web browser, and then go to the VSM management IP, which is 112.16. Here, let's go add exception. And right here, we have the Nexus 1000V extension. So we'll right click on that and save link as, and we'll put that on the desktop. So save, and that should be saved at this point. And now if we go back to the vCenter and register the plugin, so plugin, manage plugin, it's a new plugin, browse, and then we can point to that extension file that we just saved. And then down here, you click register plugin, and we can just ignore the certificate. Okay, so you can see now the plugin has been successfully registered. We can now go back to the VSM and initiate the connection to the vCenter. So the command to do that is svs connection, and then you can just give it pretty much any name you like. So you can set LM SVS or something. Okay, so now it's created. First you do protocol VMware VIM. Okay, next you have to set or specify the address, IP address of the vCenter, which is 172.16.32.5. Okay, and then we have to specify the name of the data center on the vCenter that you want the distributed vSwitch to be created in. So data center name for us is called LMDC1 or -DC1, and then enter. And the last command, so again, we have pretty much covered some of these. The last command is connect. Is to tell the VSM to initiate connection to the vCenter. So you can see immediately in the background here in the vCenter at the bottom, there's a activity that's been going on as far as the distributed vSwitch being added. So looks like that's all done. So now if we go back to vCenter and go to the networking, and here we can see the Nexus 1000V has been added as a DV switch. Okay, so now if we go back to VSM and do the show SVS domain, you can see before it said fail, but now it says successful. And if we do SVS connection, then you can see operational status is connected to the vCenter. Okay, so now the VSM is talking to the vCenter. So now we can start configuring our VSM just like any other switch or Cisco switch to support the configuration or setup we're trying to do. First, we need to create the VLANs. So we're going to be basically moving all the VLANs that's currently located on the vSwitch 1 over to the Nexus 1000V here. So this first VLAN is VLAN 32, which is our server VLAN. We'll give it a name server. Second VLAN 59, which is vMotion. Third VLAN is 60, which is iSCSI. And then we have the three mandatory VLANs on the VSM, which is N1KV, control, actually name, N1KV, control, then VLAN 112 for the management, 113 for packet. And since we know we're going to be using LACP for our uplink port channel, so we have to enable feature LACP. If you're familiar with the Nexus OS, everything is controlled by feature as far as the enabling features that you need to use. If you do show feature, I see LACP is by default disabled, so you have to do feature LACP. And now what we have to configure is what they call port profile, which is just basically a template for a port or a configuration that you're going to be applying to interfaces, whether it's a VM interface or uplink interface of the switch. So the first port profile we will be configuring is for the uplink port profile that the switch will use to talk to an external switch, which is that's going to be assigned to the VNIC 2 and 3 eventually. Okay, so start with port profile type, and you can see if you do type question mark, port profile type, question mark, there's two type, Ethernet. Ethernet is used for the physical uplink, and vEthernet is the VMware or VM virtual machine. So for type, this is uplink, so we're going to be using Ethernet, and let's call it uplink, and this is going to be uplink for the VEM, so we call uplink VEM. You can see a lot of this information is just the interface level configuration. That looks pretty much familiar to you. So the first command we do will say this is a VMware type port group. Okay, so the VSM node to push this particular port profile up to the vCenter as a port group. Now we're going to continue with the regular switch port configuration with the switch mode trunk because it's going to be carrying multiple VLAN, and we're going to only allow certain VLANs in there. that will be 32, 59 through 60, 111 through 113, which are all the VLANs that we just created. Okay, so we see a little message to show up here, basically just telling you that you just included some of the VLAN that's the VSM use for control and packets and on the uplink. So you need to make sure that you configure those as a system VLAN, and that's exactly what we're going to do. But before that, we're going to be putting this particular port to the port channel. So we use port channel group instead of using a number. We use auto, so the port number will be automatically selected by the VSM. For auto, and then mode, you have a couple options here. Active passive is for LACP, and that's when you connect your server or your 1000V to a switch that's capable of port channel with LACP. And you can also do mode on in case the upstream switch does not support LACP. For example, if you do like a UCS setup and this port is basically connected up to the fabric interconnect, then you do mode on with the MAC pinning, because when it connects to the fabric interconnect A and B, they're not capable of doing port channel. So it's basically you have to do MAC pinning to get around that. But for us, we are connected to an upstream switch that's doing LACP, so it's going to be mode active or passive if you choose to do active on the other side. They do no shutdown. And now, before we finish up, we have to assign or specify the system VLAN. For us, system VLAN is going to be the critical VLAN that we want the switch to forward regardless of the connection state between the VM and the VSM. And that would be of server VLAN 32, where the vCenter is located, as well as the management IPs of the two ESXi hosts. VLAN 60, which the ESXi host used to communicate to the backend iSCSI storage, as well as all the control management and packet VLAN that we need to make a system VLAN as well. So that would be 32, 60, 111 to 113. Okay, so last thing we want to do is state enable. As soon as you do that, you can see a little blink in the background, and now we have that particular port profile pushed up to the vCenter right here, uplink VEM. Okay, so that took care of the uplinks. Now we have to go through this and create the individual port profile for the VM facing interface. The first one we do is the VLAN 32. So port profile type, this time since it's VM facing, it's going to be vEthernet with VM, let's call it VM_32, since we use VLAN 32. Again, VMware port group. It's going to be mode access since it's carrying only single VLAN. And switch port access VLAN 32 and no shut. 32 should be a system VLAN, so we need to specify system VLAN 32. Okay, state enable. Okay, now just have to go through and configure the rest of the port profile for each of the VLANs that we have. Let's see if we can try to copy and paste some of these from what we created already. So, for example, port profile VLAN 32, let's copy that. And let me bring up the notepad. Okay, so we have 32. Now we have to do 59. And VLAN 59, which is vMotion, doesn't really have to be system VLAN, so you can take that off. Next we do VLAN 60, which is iSCSI. 60, and that has to be system VLAN. And now we have to do the 3 VSM VLAN, which is 111, 111, 111. Let's copy that. Then 112, 112, 112, and 113, 3, and 3. Okay, and all this has to be system VLAN. So copy all that, paste. And let's close that down and check. You can see all those port profile has been pushed up to the vCenter. Okay, so now that we have all those configured, we are ready to add the host to the vSwitch, or in the sense we're going to be installing a VEM to each of the ESXi.